An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine by John Henry Newman. Chapter 6, Part 3. We must not forget the well-known character of the Roman state in its dealings with its subjects. It had had from the first an extreme jealousy of secret societies. It was prepared to grant a large toleration and a broad comprehension, but, as is the case with modern governments, it wished to have jurisdiction and the ultimate authority in every movement of the body politic and social, and its civil institutions were based, or essentially depended, on its religion. Accordingly, every innovation upon the established paganism, except it was allowed by the law, was rigidly repressed. Hence the professors of low superstitions, of mysteries, of magic, of astrology, were the outlaws of society, and were in a condition analogous, if the comparison may be allowed, to smugglers or poachers among ourselves, or perhaps to burglars and highwaymen. The modern robber is sometimes made to ask, in novels or essays, why the majority of a people should bind the minority, and why he is amenable to laws which he does not enact. But the magistrate, relying on the power of the sword, wishes all men to gain a living indeed and to prosper, but only in his own legally sanctioned ways, and he hangs or transports dissenters from his authority. The Romans applied this rule to religion. Lardner protests against Pliny's application of the words contumacy and inflexible obstinacy to the Christians of Pontus. Indeed, these are hard words, he says, very improperly applied to men who were open to conviction and willing to satisfy others if they might have leave to speak. And he says, "It seems to me that Pliny acted very arbitrarily and unrighteously in his treatment of the Christians in his province. What right had Pliny to act in this manner? By what law or laws did he punish them with death?" But the Romans had ever burnt the sorcerer and banished his consulters for life. It was an ancient custom. And at mysteries they looked with especial superstition, because, since the established religion did not include them in its provisions, they really did supply what may be called a demand of the age. The Greeks of an earlier day had naturalized among themselves the Eleusinian and other mysteries which had come from Egypt and Syria, and had little to fear from a fresh invasion from the same quarter. Yet even in Greece, as Plutarch tells us, the Carmina of the itinerants of Cybele and Serapis threw the Pythian verses out of fashion, and henceforth the responses from the temple were given in prose. Soon the oracles altogether ceased. What would cause in the Roman mind still greater jealousy of Christianity was the general infidelity which prevailed among all classes as regards the mythological fables of Charon, Cerberus, and the realms of punishment. We know what opposition had been made in Rome even to the philosophy of Greece. Much greater would be the aversion of constitutional statesmen and lawyers to the ritual of barbarians. Religion was the Roman point of honor. "Spaniards might rival them in numbers," says Cicero, "Gauls in bodily strength, Carthaginians in address, Greeks in the arts, Italians and Latins in native talent. But the Romans surpassed all nations in piety and devotion." It was one of their laws, "Let no one have gods by himself, nor worship in private new gods, nor adventitious, unless added on public authority." Lutatius at the end of the First Punic War, was forbidden by the Senate to consult the sortes praenestinae as being auspicia alienagena. Some years afterwards, the consul took axe in hand and commenced the destruction of the temples of Isis and Serapis. In the Second Punic War, the Senate had commanded the surrender of the libri vadicini, or precationes, and any written art of sacrificing. When a secret confraternity was discovered at a later date, the consul spoke of the rule of their ancestors, which forbade the forum, circus, and city to sacrificuli and prophets, and burnt their books. In the next age, banishment was inflicted on individuals who were introducing the worship of the Syrian Sabazius, and in the next, the Isaion and Serapion were destroyed a second time. Maecenas, in Dio, advises Augustus to honor the gods according to the national custom, because the contempt of the country's deities leads to civil insubordination, reception of foreign laws, conspiracies, and secret meetings. Suffer no one, he adds, to deny the gods or to practice sorcery. The civilian Julius Paulus lays it down as one of the leading principles of Roman law that those who introduce new or untried religions should be degraded, and if in the lower orders, put to death. In like manner, it is enacted in one of Constantine's laws that the haruspices should not exercise their art in private. And there is a law of Valentinians against nocturnal sacrifices or magic. It is more immediately to our purpose that Trajan had been so earnest in his resistance to hetairai, or secret societies, that when a fire had laid waste Nicomedia, and Pliny proposed to him to incorporate a body of 150 firemen in consequence, he was afraid of the precedent and forbade it. What has been said will suggest another point of view in which the Oriental rites were obnoxious to the government, viz., as being vagrant and proselytizing religions. If it tolerated foreign superstitions, this would be on the ground that districts or countries within its jurisdiction held them. To proselytize to a rite hitherto unknown, to form a new party, and to propagate it through the empire, a religion not local but Catholic, was an offense against both order and reason. The state desired peace everywhere and no change. Considering, according to Lactantius, that they were rightly and deservedly punished who execrated the public religion handed down to them by their ancestors. It is impossible, surely, to deny that in assembling for religious purposes, the Christians were breaking a solemn law, a vital principle of the Roman constitution, and this was the light in which their conduct was regarded by the historians and philosophers of the empire. This was a very strong act on the part of the disciples of the great apostle who had enjoined obedience to the powers that be. Time after time they resisted the authority of the magistrate, and this is a phenomenon inexplicable on the theory of private judgment or the voluntary principle. The justification of such disobedience lies simply in the necessity of obeying the higher authority of some divine law. But if Christianity were in its essence only private and personal, as so many now think, there was no necessity of their meeting together at all. If, on the other hand, in assembling for worship and Holy Communion, they were fulfilling an indispensable observance. Christianity has imposed a social law on the world, and formally enters the field of politics. Gibbon says that, in consequence of Pliny's edict, the prudence of the Christians suspended their agape, but it was impossible for them to omit the exercise of public worship. We can draw no other conclusion. At the end of 300 years, a more remarkable violation of law seems to have been admitted by the Christian body. It shall be given in the words of Dr. Burton. He has been speaking of Maximin's edict, which provided for the restitution of any of their lands or buildings which had been alienated from them. "It is plain," he says, "from the terms of this edict, that the Christians had for some time been in possession of property. It speaks of houses and lands which did not belong to individuals, but to the whole body. Their possession of such property could hardly have escaped the notice of the government, but it seems to have been held in direct violation of a law of Diocletian, which prohibited corporate bodies, or associations which were not legally recognized, from acquiring property. The Christians were certainly not a body recognized by law at the beginning of the reign of Diocletian, and it might almost be thought that this enactment was specially directed against them. But like other laws which are founded upon tyranny, and are at variance with the first principles of justice, it is probable that this law about corporate property was evaded. We must suppose that the Christians had purchased lands and houses before the law was passed, and their disregard of the prohibition may be taken as another proof that their religion had now taken so firm a footing that the executors of the law were obliged to connive at their being broken by so numerous a body. No wonder that the magistrate who presided at the martyrdom of St. Romanus calls them in Prudentius a rebel people, that Galerius speaks of them as a nefarious conspiracy, the heathen in Minucius as men of a desperate faction, that others make them guilty of sacrilege and treason, and call them by those other titles which, more closely resembling the language of Tacitus, have been noticed above. Hence the violent accusations against them as the destruction of the empire, the authors of physical evils, and the cause of the anger of the gods. Men cry out, says Tertullian, that the state is beset, that the Christians are in their fields, in their forts, in their islands. They mourn, as for a loss, that every sex, condition, and now even rank, is going over to this sect. And yet they do not by this very means advance their minds to the idea of some good therein hidden. They allow not themselves to conjecture more rightly. They choose not to examine more closely. The generality run upon a hatred of this name, with eyes so closed that in bearing favorable testimony to anyone, they mingle with it the reproach of the name. A good man, Caius Seius, only he is a Christian. So another, I marvel that this wise man Lucius Titius hath suddenly become a Christian. No one reflecteth whether Caius be not therefore good, and Lucius wise, because a Christian, or therefore a Christian because wise and good. They praise that which they know, they revile that which they know not. Virtue is not in such account as hatred of the Christians. Now then, if the hatred be of the name, what guilt is there in names? What charge against words? unless it be that any word which is a name have either a barbarous or ill-omened, or a scurrilous, or an immodest sound. If the Tiber cometh up to the walls, if the Nile cometh not up to the fields, if the heaven hath stood still, if the earth hath been moved, if there be any famine, if there be any pestilence, the Christians to the lions is forthwith the word. Men of a desperate, lawless, reckless faction, says the heathen Cecilius, in the passage above referred to, who collect together out of the lowest rabble the thoughtless portion, and credulous women seduced by the weakness of their sects, and form a mob of impure conspirators, of whom nocturnal assemblies and solemn fastings and unnatural food, no sacred rite but pollution, is the bond. A tribe lurking and light-hating, dumb for the public, talkative in corners. They despise our temples as if graves, spit at our gods, deride our religious forms. Pitiable themselves, they pity, forsooth, our priests. Half naked themselves, they despise our honours and purple. Monstrous folly and incredible impudence. ... Day after day their abandoned morals wind their serpentine course. Over the whole world are those most hideous rites of an impious association growing into shape. ... They recognize each other by marks and signs, and love each other almost before they recognize. Promiscuous lust is their religion. Thus does their vain and mad superstition glory in crimes. ... The writer who tells the story of a criminal capitally punished, and of the gibbet, linea feralia, of the cross being their observance, ceremonias, assigns to them thereby an altar in keeping with the abandoned and wicked, that they may worship, what they merit. ... Why their mighty effort to hide and shroud whatever it is they worship, since things honest ever like the open day, and crimes are secret? Why have they no altars, no temples, no images known to us? Never speak abroad, never assemble freely, were it not that what they worship and suppress is subject either of punishment or of shame? ... What monstrous, what portentous notions do they fabricate? That God of theirs, whom they can neither show nor see, should be inquiring diligently into the characters, the acts, nay, the words and secret thoughts of all men, running to and fro, forsooth, and present everywhere, troublesome, restless, nay, impudently curious they would have him. That is, if he is close at every deed, interferes in all places, while he can neither attend to each as being distracted through the whole, nor suffice for the whole as being engaged about each. Think, too, of their threatening fire, meditating destruction to the whole earth, nay, the world itself with its stars. ... Nor content with this mad opinion, they add and append their old wives' tales about a new birth after death, ashes, and cinders, and by some strange confidence believe each other's lies. Poor creatures, consider what hangs over you after death while you are still alive. Lo, the greater part of you, the better, as you say, are in want, cold, toil, hunger, and your God suffers it. But I omit common trials. Lo, threats are offered to you, punishments, torments, crosses, to be undergone now, not worshipped, adorandi, fires too, which ye predict and fear. Where is that God who can recover but not preserve your life? The answer of Socrates, when he was asked about heavenly matters, is well known. What is above us does not concern us. My opinion also is, that points which are doubtful, as are the points in question, must be left. Nor when so many and such great men are in controversy on the subject, must judgment be rashly and audaciously given to either side, lest the consequence be either anile superstition, or the overthrow of all religion. Such was Christianity in the eyes of those who witnessed its rise and propagation. One of a number of wild and barbarous rites which were pouring in upon the empire from the ancient realms of superstition, and the mother of a progeny of sects which were faithful to the original they had derived from Egypt or Syria. A religion unworthy of an educated person, as appealing not to the intellect, but to the fears and weaknesses of human nature, and consisting not in the rational and cheerful enjoyment, but in a morose rejection of the gifts of Providence. A horrible religion, as inflicting or enjoining cruel sufferings, and monstrous and loathsome in its very indulgence of the passions. A religion leading to reaction to infidelity. A religion of magic and of the vulgar arts, real and pretended, with which magic was accompanied. A secret religion which dared not face the day. An itinerant, busy, proselytizing religion, forming an extended conspiracy against the state, resisting its authority, and breaking its laws. There may be some exceptions to this general impression, such as Pliny's discovery of the innocent and virtuous rule of life adopted by the Christians of Pontus. But this only proves that Christianity was not, in fact, the infamous religion which the heathen thought it. It did not reverse their general belief to that effect. Now, it must be granted that in some respects this view of Christianity depended on the times, and would alter with their alteration. When there was no persecution, martyrs could not be obstinate, and when the Church was raised aloft in high places, it was no longer in caves. Still, I believe it continued substantially the same in the judgment of the world external to it, while there was an external world to judge of it. They thought it enough, says Julian in the 4th century, of our Lord and his apostles, to deceive women, servants, and slaves, and by their means wives and husbands. A human fabrication, says he elsewhere, put together by wickedness, having nothing divine in it, but making a perverted use of the fable-loving, childish, irrational part of the soul, and offering a set of wonders to create belief. Miserable men, he says elsewhere, you refuse to worship the ancile, yet you worship the wood of the cross, and sign it on your foreheads, and fix it on your doors. Shall one for this hate the intelligent among you, or pity the less understanding, who in following you have gone to such an excess of perdition as to leave the everlasting gods, and go over to a dead Jew? He speaks of their adding other dead men to him who died so long ago. You have filled all places with sepulchres and monuments, though it is nowhere told you in your religion to haunt the tombs and to attend upon them. Elsewhere he speaks of their leaving the gods for corpses and relics. On the other hand, he attributes the growth of Christianity to its humanity towards strangers, care in burying the dead, and pretended religiousness of life. In another place he speaks of their care of the poor. Libanius, Julian's preceptor in rhetoric, delivers the same testimony, as far as it goes. He addressed his oration for the temples to a Christian emperor, and would in consequence be guarded in his language. However, it runs in one direction. He speaks of those black-habited men, meaning the monks, who eat more than elephants, and by the number of their potations trouble those who send them drink in their chantings, and conceal this by paleness artificially acquired. They are in good condition out of the misfortunes of others, while they pretend to serve God by hunger. Those whom they attack are like bees, they like drones. I do not quote this passage to prove that there were monks in Libanius's days, which no one doubts, but to show his impression of Christianity, as far as his works betray it. Numantian, in the same century, describes in verse his voyage from Rome to Gaul. One book of the poem is extant. He falls in with Christianity on 2 of the islands which lie in his course. He thus describes them as found on one of these. The island is in a squalid state, being full of light-haters. They call themselves monks, because they wish to live alone without witness, monachos. They dread the gifts from fearing the reverses of fortune. Thus Homer says that melancholy was the cause of Bellerophon's anxiety. For it is said that after the wounds of grief, mankind displeased the offended youth. He meets on the other island a Christian whom he had known, of good family and fortune, and happy in his marriage, who, impelled by the Furies, had left men and gods, and, credulous exile, was living in base concealment. Is not this herd, he continues, worse than Circean poison? Then bodies were changed, now minds. In the Philopatris, which is the work of an author of the 4th century, Critias is introduced, pale and wild. His friend asks him if he has seen Cerberus or Hecate, and he answers that he has heard a rigmarole from certain thrice-cursed sophists, which he thinks would drive him mad if he heard it again, and was nearly sending him headlong over some cliff as it was. He retires, for relief, with his inquirer, to a pleasant place, shadowed by plane trees, where swallows and nightingales are singing, and a quiet brook is purling. Triophon, his friend, expresses a fear lest he has heard some incantation, and is led by the course of the dialogue, before his friend tells his tale, to give some account of Christianity, being himself a Christian. After speaking of the creation as described by Moses, he falls at once upon that doctrine of a particular providence which is so distasteful to Plutarch, Velleius in Cicero, and Cecilius, and generally to unbelievers. He is in heaven, he says, looking at just and unjust, and causing actions to be entered in books, and he will recompense all on a day which he has appointed. Critias objects that he cannot make this consistent with the received doctrine about the fates, even though he has perhaps been carried aloft with his master and initiated in unspeakable mysteries. He also asks if the deeds of the Scythians are written in heaven, for if so, there must be many scribes there. After some more words, in the course of which, as in the earlier part of the dialogue, the doctrine of the Holy Trinity is introduced, Critias gives an account of what befell him. He says he fell in with a crowd in the streets, and while asking a friend the cause of it, others joined them, Christians or monks, and a conversation ensues, part of it corrupt or obscure, on the subject, as Gesner supposes, of Julian's oppression of the Christians, especially of the clergy. One of these interlocutors is a wretched old man whose phlegm is paler than death. Another has a rotten cloak on, and no covering on head or feet, who says he has been told by some ill-clad person from the mountains with a shorn crown that in the theatre was a name hieroglyphically written of one who would flood the highway with gold. On his laughing at the story, his friend Crato, whom he had joined, bids him be silent, using a Pythagorean word, for he has most excellent matters to initiate him into, and that the prediction is no dream, but true, and will be fulfilled in August, using the Egyptian name of the month. He attempts to leave them in disgust, but Crato pulls him back at the instigation of that old demon. He is in consequence persuaded to go to those conjurers, who, says Crato, would initiate in all mysteries. He finds in a building which is described in the language used by Homer of the palace of Menelaus, not Helen, no, but men pale and downcast, who ask whether there was any bad news. For they seemed, he says, wishing the worst, and rejoicing in misfortune, as the Furies in the theatres. On their asking him how the city and the world went on, and his answering that things went on smoothly, and seemed likely to do so still, they frown and say that the city is in travail with a bad birth. You, who dwell aloft, he answers, and see everything from on high, doubtless have a keen perception in this matter. But tell me, how is the sky? Will the sun be eclipsed? Will Mars be in quadrature with Jupiter? Etc. And he goes on to jest upon their celibacy, on their persisting in prophesying evil to the state. He says, "This evil will fall on your own head, since you are so hard upon your country. For not as high flyers have you heard this, nor are ye adepts in the restless astrological art, but if divinations and conjurings have seduced you, double is your stupidity, for they are the discoveries of old women, and things to laugh at." The interview then draws to an end, but more than enough has been quoted already to show the author's notion of Christianity. Such was the language of paganism after Christianity had for 50 years been exposed to the public gaze. After it had been before the world for 50 more, St. Augustine had still to defend it against the charge of being the cause of the calamities of the empire. And for the charge of magic, when the Arian bishops were in formal disputation with the Catholic before Gungobald, Burgundian king of France, at the end of the 5th century, we find still that they charged the Catholics with being prestigiatores, and worshipping a number of gods. And when the Catholics proposed that the king should repair to the shrine of St. Justus, where both parties might ask him concerning their respective faiths, the Arians cried out that they would not seek enchantments like Saul, for Scripture was enough for them, which was more powerful than all bewitchments. This was said not against strangers of whom they knew nothing, as Ethelbert might be suspicious of St. Augustine and his brother missionaries, but against a body of men who lived among them. I do not think it can be doubted, then, that had Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny, Celsus, Porphyry, and the other opponents of Christianity lived in the 4th century, their evidence concerning Christianity would be very much the same as it has come down to us from the centuries before it. In either case, a man of the world and a philosopher would have been disgusted at the gloom and sadness of its profession, its mysteriousness, its claim of miracles, the want of good sense imputable to its rule of life, and the unsettlement and discord it was introducing into the social and political world. On the whole, then, I conclude as follows. If there is a form of Christianity now in the world which is accused of gross superstition, of borrowing its rites and customs from the heathen, and of ascribing to forms and ceremonies an occult virtue, a religion which is considered to burden and enslave the mind by its requisitions, to address itself to the weak-minded and ignorant, to be supported by sophistry and imposture, and to contradict reason and exalt mere irrational faith, a religion which impresses on the serious mind very distressing views of the guilt and consequences of sin, sets upon the minute acts of the day, one by one, their definite value for praise and blame, and thus casts a grave shadow over the future, a religion which holds up to admiration the surrender of wealth, and disables serious persons from enjoying it if they would, a religion, the doctrines of which, be they good or bad, are to the generality of men unknown, which is considered to bear on its very surface signs of folly and falsehood so distinct that a glance suffices to judge of it, and that careful examination is preposterous, which is felt to be so simply bad that it may be calumniated at hazard and at pleasure, it being nothing but absurdity to stand upon the accurate distribution of its guilt among its particular acts, or painfully to determine how far this or that story concerning it is literally true, or what has to be allowed in candor, or what is improbable, or what cuts two ways, or what is not proved, or what may be plausibly defended, a religion such that men look at a convert to it with a feeling which no other denomination raises, except Judaism, Socialism, or Mormonism, viz., with curiosity, suspicion, fear, disgust, as the case may be, as if something strange had befallen him, as if he had had an initiation into a mystery, and had come into communion with dreadful influences, as if he were now one of a confederacy which claimed him, absorbed him, stripped him of his personality, reduced him to a mere organ or instrument of the whole. A religion which men hate as proselytizing, antisocial, revolutionary, as dividing families, separating chief friends, corrupting the maxims of government, making a mock at law, dissolving the empire, the enemy of human nature, and a conspirator against its rights and privileges. A religion which they consider the champion and instrument of darkness, and a pollution calling down upon the land the anger of heaven. A religion which they associate with intrigue and conspiracy, which they speak about in whispers, which they detect by anticipation in whatever goes wrong, and to which they impute whatever is unaccountable. A religion the very name of which they cast out as evil, and use simply as a bad epithet, and which, from the impulse of self-preservation, they would persecute if they could. If there be such a religion now in the world, it is not unlike Christianity as that same world viewed it when first it came forth from its divine author. End of Part 3 of Chapter 6.